In a barren land where power and money rule, a young girl is trapped in a life with no way out. But when all hope seems lost, a cowboy appears, and with a single promise, he changes her life forever. But can they truly escape the ghosts of their past and reclaim their freedom for their family? Join us on this relentless journey where love and resilience triumph over every obstacle. This story is not just about salvation, but also about vengeance and the price that must be paid. Stay with us, because this tale will leave you unable to look away. The saloon was as old as the town itself, worn and weathered, its floorboards creaking under the weight of memories better left buried. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, the smell of whiskey and cheap cigars clinging to the walls like ghosts of a time long gone. Emily stood at the back of the room, wiping down the bar, her movements slow, deliberate. The soft light from the hanging lanterns cast a warm glow on her, but it did little to lift the shadows that clung to her face. She hadn't smiled in years. It wasn't that she didn't have reason to smile. It was just that the things she'd lost were far too heavy for a simple expression of joy. "Another drink, sweetheart." The voice came from behind her, gravelly and too familiar. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Walter, the man with the eyes of a vulture, a smile that never reached his lips. He had a way of making the air feel colder, even in the heat of summer. She heard his boots shuffle across the worn wooden floor as he slid onto a bar stool. Emily's fingers tightened around the rag in her hands. The memory of her father's voice echoed in her mind, a soft whisper from days long past. "You're strong, Em. Don't ever let them see you break." But it was getting harder to remember that strength, to believe in it, when every day seemed like an endless cycle of pain and sacrifice. "Make it quick, darling. You know how it is. Men like me don't have all night." Walter muttered, his voice dripping with arrogance. She didn't respond. There was no point. Walter didn't care for her words. He only wanted her to keep serving, keep smiling, keep her mouth shut. He had money, and he knew that was all that mattered in a town like this. Emily poured the whiskey, her hands shaking just slightly as she placed the glass in front of him. She wanted to turn and walk away, to leave it all behind, the saloon, the men, the misery. But there was no escape. Not for her. Not for her family. "If you're looking for a way out," darling Walter continued, leaning in closer, his breath foul with alcohol, "you'll find it right here. All it takes is a little favor for a few of the right men." He smirked, his fingers trailing over the rim of the glass. "What's it gonna be, huh? You want your family back. You want to live like a lady instead of a, well, you know." His words were poison, and she could feel them crawl under her skin. Emily's heart clenched, but she kept her face neutral. She could feel the eyes of the other men on her, their leering gazes making her skin crawl. Every one of them was a reminder of the price she'd had to pay to keep her family safe, her father sick and bedridden, and her little sister whose bright eyes had once looked at her with unshakable trust. Now those eyes were filled with fear. Fear of the men who controlled their lives, their fates. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, imagining a world where none of this was real. A world where her family was safe, where she wasn't standing behind this bar, waiting for the next cruel request. "But what choice do I have?" The words had been whispered to her 1,000 times in the dark of night. No choice. "That's right, sweetheart," Walter said, as if reading her mind, his voice lower now, slick with satisfaction. "No choice. You do what we say, and maybe, just maybe, your little sister won't end up like the rest of these poor girls." The words hung in the air like a threat. Emily's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let it show. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing much," Walter said with a smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Just a little entertainment for the boys. You make them happy, and we'll make sure your family stays intact. But you already know that, don't you? Emily's throat tightened. Her family, her parents, her sister, the thought of them in his hands, the thought of what they might be enduring if she refused, almost made her sick. She forced herself to look up at him, meeting his gaze with a level of defiance she didn't even know she had. "You can't break me, Walter." He chuckled a low, mocking sound. "Oh, sweetie, I don't need to break you. You're already broken. You've been broken for a long time." Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Her tears had been used up long ago, replaced by the silent anger that fueled her every breath. Suddenly, the door to the saloon swung open with a loud bang. The cold night air rushed in, and a tall figure stepped through. Emily didn't need to look twice to know who it was. Luke. His presence was enough to send a ripple of tension through the room. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the crowd before they locked on Emily. He didn't need to say a word. His gaze said everything she needed to hear. He saw her, truly saw her. Emily felt a flicker of something inside her, a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. It was brief, fleeting, but it was there. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. Walter turned his attention to Luke, scowling, as he stood up from the bar. "What do you want, Montgomery?" "This is a private establishment." Luke didn't flinch. He didn't need to. He walked up to the bar and leaned in close to Emily, his hand brushing hers just for a moment. It was enough. Enough to remind her that there were still good men in the world. "Leave her alone." "Walter." Luke said, his voice low but firm. Emily didn't know what to say, how to respond. For the first time, someone was standing up for her, not out of pity, not for any other reason than because he saw her as a person. Walter sneered, taking a step toward Luke. "I think you better get out of here before things get ugly." Luke stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Emily. "I'm not leaving without her." There was a long, tense silence before Walter muttered something under his breath and walked away, slinking back to the group of men. But Emily didn't watch him. Her eyes were locked on Luke. He didn't have to say anything. They both knew the truth. "You don't have to do this," Luke said quietly, his hand still resting gently on hers. Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know how to stop." Luke's voice softened, the edge of his words melting into something more tender. "I'll help you. We'll find a way out. Together." For the first time in a long time, Emily allowed herself to hope. The saloon was a different world at night, cloaked in the scent of whiskey and sweat. Emily had learned to blend in, to disappear behind the veil of the clinking glasses and the low murmurs of men who'd long since lost their decency. At first, it was the clattering of mugs and the dim flicker of lanterns that shielded her from their gazes. But now, every glance felt like a hand on her skin, pressing down, suffocating. She moved between the tables with a practiced grace, but inside the world felt different. The weight of her father's illness and the silence of her mother's frailty gnawed at her like a slow, unending ache, and in her heart there was a cold pit of guilt. Every time she stepped into the saloon, she was stepping away from them, from the life she knew, into a darkness she didn't know how to escape. "Pour me another drink, girl," came the harsh voice of Trenton Brooks, the wealthiest man in town. His hand slapped the table with a heavy thud, the sound reverberating in the stillness of the room. His eyes were cold, calculating, always watching, always demanding. He was tall, with a slicked-back mane of hair that didn't move even in the sweltering heat, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He was the kind of man who owned everything, and yet somehow never seemed satisfied. Emily hesitated, her hand faltering as she reached for the bottle. "I said," poor Trenton's voice lowered, like a snake preparing to strike. Her fingers tightened around the neck of the bottle, the glass cool in her palm. She had seen men like him before, men who thought they could control everything around them, from the land to the lives of those unfortunate enough to cross their paths. Trenton had never seen her as a person. She was nothing but a pretty face, another toy for his amusement. And the worst part, she had no choice but to comply. But that night, everything felt heavier. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the room. "You promised. My family. You said you'd let them go." A low chuckle escaped Trenton's lips, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. His eyes narrowed, a flash of something dark swimming beneath the surface. "Promises, Emily, are like the wind in this town, fickle. You think I owe you something. You think, because you've danced for me, served my every whim, that I owe you mercy." Her heart sank, the words cutting deeper than she had expected. She tried to mask the hurt, tried to bury the tremor in her voice, but it was no use. She had hoped too much. "And as for your family..." Trenton's smile grew wider, but it was all teeth, all malice. "Your father's illness doesn't concern me. What concerns me is that you understand who holds the power here. If you want them to live, you'll continue to do what we ask. Simple as that." Emily's breath hitched. Her father's condition was worsening by the day. She knew this was her only chance to keep him alive. But the cost of her dignity, her soul, it felt like too much. She felt like a ghost in her own body, tethered to this place by nothing more than a promise that was never meant to be kept. "I'm not your toy, Trenton," she managed to say, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm a person, and I deserve more than this." The man's face hardened, the glimmer of amusement fading into something far more dangerous. He rose from the table, his shadow towering over her, and for a moment, Emily thought he might strike her. But instead, he leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "Do not forget your place, Emily. You're nothing here but a servant. You've made your bed." His voice was low, venomous. "And don't think for a second that I won't destroy everything you care about if you cross me. I will ruin them. I'll ruin you." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and for a brief, terrible moment, she wondered if he was right. She had no power here, no choices left. She was stuck in a world where men like Trenton ruled with cold, calculating hands, and where mercy was just a word they threw around when they felt generous. But then, something inside her stirred. The image of her father's pale face, her mother's soft, trembling hands, and the memory of the love they had all shared came rushing back to her. They had given everything for her, sacrificed their lives, so she could have a chance at something better. She would not let it all fall apart. With shaking hands, Emily poured Trenton's drink, her gaze never leaving his. She forced herself to hold the glass steady as she placed it in front of him, the weight of her own soul pressing against her chest. "I will do what you ask," she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "But not because I want to. Not because you have the right to make me." She turned to walk away, but Trenton's voice stopped her. "You think you have any control here? You think you can resist me? You're mine now, Emily. You'll do what I say, or you'll lose everything." His words stung, but Emily didn't flinch. She walked away from him, from the table, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe. Her heart still raced, but there was something different in the way she carried herself. Something inside her had shifted. She didn't know what her next step would be. But she knew this: she was no longer just a servant. She was a woman with a voice, with the strength to stand up for what mattered. And whatever came next, she would face it with that knowledge. Emily stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her face like a balm. She leaned against the wooden post, closing her eyes and drawing in a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, she let herself feel something other than fear. Something warm, something that had been buried too deep inside her for far too long. She would find a way out of this. She had to. And somewhere deep down, she knew that she wouldn't face it alone. The saloon was thick with the pungent scent of smoke and whiskey, the kind of air that clung to your lungs and soured your thoughts. The dusty floor creaked under the weight of boots and the hum of coarse conversation. Emily moved through it like a shadow, her every step heavy with the burden of the choices she'd made. The men lounging at the bar and around the tables paid her little attention, now their eyes only glancing her way when they needed a drink or a smile to pass the time. She was just another piece of the scenery, nothing more. That's how she had come to see herself, a fixture, unseen, forgotten. Her mind wandered back to the promise she had made herself when she first stepped into this wretched place. She'd vowed she would endure for as long as it took, that she would be strong for her family. But strength had a way of wearing thin when you were surrounded by nothing but weakness, when your own heart was the one thing left to cling to, and it seemed to falter with every breath. She didn't hear him at first. His presence was subtle, like the whisper of a breeze that makes you glance around, wondering if it had been there all along. But when she did finally look up, she met his gaze, and the world tilted. The cowboy stood at the entrance, his silhouette framed by the harsh light of the doorway, casting a long shadow across the room. He wasn't a man to be ignored. His eyes, sharp and intense, met hers across the space, and for the briefest moment, she saw something in them that she had forgotten how to recognize: hope. Not the kind of hope that clung to the fragile edges of broken dreams, but the kind that stood tall and unyielding in the face of every harsh truth. Luke. The name echoed in her mind, and she found herself frozen, caught somewhere between disbelief and the desperate longing to believe he was real. He stepped forward slow and measured as if he had all the time in the world. His boots scraped against the floor, each step deliberate, a sound that seemed louder than any of the clamor in the saloon. He was close now, his presence commanding, and yet there was a gentleness in his eyes, a tenderness that made the sharp contrast of the saloon's atmosphere feel all the more jarring. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he watched her, his gaze unwavering, as if studying the contours of her face, the shadows beneath her eyes. When he finally did speak, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that settled deep within her chest. "You don't belong here." She flinched, the words sinking into her like shards of glass. She swallowed, but her throat was dry, the sting of his words more painful than she had expected. "Is that what you think?" she replied, her voice quiet, but edged with something she hadn't expected. Defiance. Luke didn't flinch. He only nodded slightly, as if he knew exactly what she was trying to say, but refused to allow her to remain there trapped by her own doubts. "No one belongs here, Emily." His voice softened, the words carrying a gravity that seemed to draw her in. "But I don't believe it's too late for you." Her heart skipped a beat. His words, simple as they were, carried the weight of a promise she hadn't dared to believe in for a long time. "I don't have a choice," she said, though the words felt foreign to her now. "They've taken everything." Luke's gaze darkened slightly, but his jaw tightened in resolve. "You still have yourself. That's the only thing they can't take away, and it's the only thing worth fighting for." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed to thicken, full of unspoken understanding. Emily's mind raced. The walls she had carefully built over the years, the ones that had kept her safe, seemed to crack in front of her. She couldn't afford to believe in anything, not in him, not in anything that promised her freedom. She had learned the hard way that the world was full of empty promises, broken dreams, and men who would sell their souls for a bit of power. But something in Luke's eyes was different. He wasn't asking her to trust him. He was asking her to trust herself. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, his voice steady, though the question carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. She looked at him, really, looked at him for the first time, and something inside her stirred. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but it was a feeling she hadn't felt in years. The smallest flicker of something that could be called hope. I don't know how she whispered the words, barely escaping her lips. Luke's hand shifted on the worn handle of his saddlebags, and then without warning he reached out his fingers, brushing lightly against her arm. The touch was so simple, so brief, but it felt like a lifeline. "You don't need to know," how he said softly. "You just need to know you're worth it." The saloon seemed to fade away in that moment, the noise dulling to a distant hum as the weight of his words settled into her heart. She had never been told she was worth anything, not by anyone who mattered, not by the men who had used her, not by the world that had cast her aside. But Luke's voice, his steady, unwavering voice, had broken through all the walls she had built, and for the first time in years, Emily felt something she couldn't name rise inside her, the desire to believe. "I can't leave," she said, the words now soft, with the understanding that she had been lying to herself all this time. "I have to stay. I have to save them." Luke's face softened, a flash of compassion in his eyes. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Her heart trembled at the tenderness in his voice. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Let me help you," he said, his voice steady and unwavering, but there was a flicker of something more, something that wasn't just about saving her, but about offering her a chance at salvation, a chance at life. She didn't answer right away. The weight of the moment, the rawness of his words settled heavily between them. But then, with a quiet breath, Emily turned slightly, her gaze lifting to meet his fully. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of a life beyond this hell. And that was enough. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and despair. The sun had long since dipped beneath the horizon, leaving the land cold and empty, just like Emily's heart. She stood at the edge of the dusty clearing, the moonlight casting long shadows on the earth. In the distance, the crickets began their mournful song, as if the very earth itself were mourning the life she had lost. Behind her, Luke's voice was soft but insistent. "We can't wait any longer, Emily. We have to go now." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with doubt. She wasn't sure if she could ever move past the horror she had lived through, let alone the weight of what was to come. The taste of bile still lingered on her tongue from the night before, the night she had betrayed herself, betrayed everything she stood for. "I can't leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not yet. Not until I know they're safe." Luke stepped forward, his expression as fierce as the wild stallions he once rode. His eyes bore into hers, filled with a quiet determination that spoke louder than any words. He reached out gently, taking her hand. "Emily," he said, his voice low, the kind of voice that a person could drown in. "You can't save them alone. You can't save anyone if you stay trapped here." She wanted to argue, to tell him that he didn't understand, that he hadn't seen the things she had, but instead her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew it was true. But the memory of her parents, the memory of her sister's trembling face as the men had taken them away, haunted her like the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten dreams. Emily's breath hitched, and she felt the weight of those memories press down on her chest. "Why did it have to be me?" "Luke." Her voice broke. "Why couldn't they just leave us alone? We never asked for this." Luke's jaw clenched, his lips pulling into a tight line. His face softened as he stepped closer to her. "You didn't ask for this, but you can still make a choice. You can still take control. You're stronger than you know." Her mind screamed at her to run, to forget about everything, to disappear into the night and never look back. But her heart was pulling her in another direction, one she didn't want to follow. Because the truth was, Emily had never been the kind of person who could just leave someone behind. Not her family. Not now. The memory of the men, the way they had sneered at her, the way they had forced her into that life, that role, made her skin crawl. They had taken everything from her, her dignity, her choices, her sense of self, and now they wanted her to keep their secrets. "Luke," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "they have my family. If I leave now, they'll kill them. I can't let that happen." Luke's hand tightened around hers, his voice unwavering. "And you think you can stop them by staying? The only way to save your family is to fight for them. They're counting on you, Emily, not the girl you were before, but the woman you've become." She closed her eyes, the tears threatening to spill. Her throat constricted as she thought about her parents, frail and weak, trapped in the hands of men who saw them as nothing more than pawns in a game. "Maybe I am the woman who fights," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. "But I don't know if I can live with myself afterward. I don't know if I can face the things I'll have to do to save them." Luke's expression softened as he stepped forward. His thumb brushed her cheek, catching a tear that had escaped. "You're not alone, Emily. We're in this together. I've seen the fire in you. Don't let it go out now." The fire in her. She had once thought it was gone, snuffed out by the cruelty of the world. But now, in the presence of Luke's unwavering support, she could feel it reigniting a spark of defiance in her chest. "I have to do this, don't I?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just looked at her as though he were searching for something deep within her. His eyes softened, and then with the gentleness of a man who had seen the worst of the world and still chose to believe in good, he spoke the words she needed to hear. "Yes, Emily, you do." She took a shaky breath and nodded. It was as though the weight of 1,000 lifetimes had shifted, and the truth was clear now. She couldn't keep hiding. She had to face the world. She had to face the men who had stolen everything from her. Turning away from Luke, she squared her shoulders. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of what was at stake. She had made her decision. She would go to them, and she would make them pay. Meanwhile, in the darkened corner of the town, the men who had enslaved her were laughing. Thaddeus Vane, the leader of the group, sat at the head of the table, his voice cold and cruel. "She'll come crawling back," he sneered. "They always do." One of the men, a tall, thin figure with eyes that gleamed like a snake, leaned forward, his voice dripping with malice. "She'll do anything to save them, even if it means becoming one of us." Thaddeus smiled darkly. "Exactly. She's nothing more than a tool to get what we want, and when she's done, she'll be nothing but a broken thing, just like the rest." Emily's stomach churned as she remembered those words. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that she was no longer the same woman they had tortured. She had learned something in these past days, something that would change the course of everything. She wasn't just a tool. She was a weapon, and she would use it to tear down everything they had built. The moon hung heavy in the sky, watching over the land as Emily stood at the crossroads of her fate. She wasn't just fighting for her family anymore. She was fighting for herself. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers she could never have imagined, but Emily had never been one to shy away from a fight. And as the wind picked up once again, she turned to Luke, the only person who had ever truly seen her. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady, but filled with something else, something stronger than fear. Luke nodded, his face resolute. "Then let's go, Emily. Let's make them pay." And together, they walked toward the storm that would change everything. The wind howled through the barren landscape, stirring up dust and memories long buried. Emily stood on the porch of the small cabin, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last embers of sunset kissed the earth with a soft blood-red hue. The same red that once stained her past, the same red that still flickered in the corners of her mind like a restless flame. She thought she had left it all behind. The town, the men who held her family hostage not just by chains, but by the cruelty of their power. But just as the storm clouds gather on the horizon, so did the shadow of her past return insistent and unforgiving. "They're coming." Luke's voice broke through the silence deep and low. She didn't need to ask who he meant. She had known it was only a matter of time. The men who had once torn her world apart were coming back for their revenge. They always came back. The men had thought her silence was a sign of submission, that her retreat into the quiet life was just another way of hiding from them. But they didn't understand Emily had been hiding for herself, for the family she was saving for the life she had been reclaiming. And now, with their return, she would be forced to face the echoes of a past she had hoped never to hear again. She turned away from the porch, her hands trembling as she stepped inside the cabin. Luke was already there, standing by the hearth, the soft glow of the fire casting shadows over his strong features. His eyes, so steady now, looked haunted, as if he too could hear the echo of footsteps he had tried so hard to outrun. "I don't want you to face them, Emily," he said, his voice tight with a concern she knew too well. "They're dangerous. These men, they're not the ones we should let near you." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle yet firm. "You don't get it, Luke. They've already taken everything from me, and now they think they can come back and take the one thing I've fought for, the peace of my soul, the safety of my family. I won't let them." The next morning, the town was silent. Too silent. Emily felt the weight of it in her bones, the same silence that had preceded the worst days of her life. She and Luke rode out together, the wind whipping through their hair, their horses' hooves, the only sound that dared to break the stillness. When they reached the town's outskirts, they found the men waiting for them. A group of wealthy, arrogant men, their eyes cold, their grins dripping with malice. At their helm was Trenton, the same man who had once made her life a living hell. "Well, well, Emily Trenton," said his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "You've done well for yourself, haven't you? Found a nice little cabin, some peace and quiet. It's cute, really. But you've forgotten something, your place. Your true place." Emily stepped forward, her jaw clenched, her heart pounding but steady. "I'm not the same girl you knew, Trenton, and you're not the same man. You're a coward hiding behind wealth and power. You can't take what isn't yours anymore." Trenton laughed, a low, cruel sound. "Oh, but I can. You see, Emily, you've always belonged to us. We gave you everything, your family's safety, your life. And now you will pay the price for betraying us. You and your little cowboy here." Luke stepped forward, his hand gripping the reins tighter, but Emily held him back. She knew the power in silence, in the stillness of the storm before it broke. "You've taken enough already," Emily said quietly, but with a resolve that sent a chill through the men around her. "You think you can scare me with your threats, but you don't understand your power has already faded. The moment you took my family and tried to control me, you sealed your own fate." Trenton's face darkened, the jovial mask slipping. "You still don't understand, do you? You are nothing but a tool, a toy. You have no power. You never did." His words cut deep, but they didn't wound her. They only reminded her of what she had survived. The pain of his words, the sting of his judgment, it was nothing compared to what she had already endured. In that moment, something changed in Emily. She no longer saw the men before her as powerful oppressors. They were pitiful, weak, grasping at the remnants of control they had long lost. It was time to finish what had been started all those years ago. Luke's eyes met hers, a silent understanding passing between them. He nodded once, and Emily turned back to face Trenton and the others. "You don't own me," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with the weight of truth. "You never did." The wind picked up howling once more. The battle was not just physical. It was a battle of wills, of strength, and of the resilience of the human spirit. Emily's heart beat steadily in her chest, her hands firm on the reins, her eyes locked with Trenton's. "You will never control me again." The days that followed were a blur of strategy and swift action. Luke, Emily, and their small group of loyal friends moved through the night, dismantling the lives of the men who had once held the town in their grip. The journey was long and fraught with danger, but Emily knew now this was the only way to rid herself of the chains they had wrapped around her heart. By the time the sun set on the final confrontation, Trenton and his men had been stripped of their power. The town, which had once been under their shadow, was free. But it was not just the men who had been liberated. Emily had freed herself, and in doing so, she had healed the wounds of her past. As they stood together, looking out at the town that had been forever changed, Emily turned to Luke, her eyes soft. "It's over now, isn't it?" Luke nodded, his hand brushing against hers. "It is. But you know, Emily, there's always a part of us that will carry the past. It's what makes us who we are. And you're stronger than you ever were before." Emily looked down at her hands, calloused from years of hard work, but steady. "I don't need to be stronger anymore, Luke. I just need to be whole." The sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting a gentle light across the land. Emily and Luke stood side by side, a quiet moment of peace between them. In that silence, there was no need for words. The world was different now, and so were they. Emily had found her way back to herself, to her family, and to the life she had always dreamed of. And as the stars began to twinkle above, Emily knew that the road ahead was one of healing, not just for her, but for all who had been touched by the darkness of the past. It was time to finally let go, and for the first time, breathe. The wind howled through the canyon, biting at their skin like a reminder that the world didn't owe them a thing. Luke stood at the edge of the cliff, his coat billowing behind him, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something that only he could see. Beside him, Emily held her breath, her hands trembling in the cold, the weight of everything they had fought for pressing down on her chest. She could feel the tension in the air, like the pause before a storm. The day they had been waiting for had come, but it felt nothing like she had imagined. No victory banners, no cheers. Just the distant thrum of her heart, the steady beat of fear and anticipation. They were about to do something that could change everything. She looked at Luke, his face still carrying the shadow of a man who had seen too much. His eyes, always so steady now, held something different, something softer, something that caught her breath every time he glanced her way. The memories of their first encounter, the moments when she had felt trapped and unseen, had faded into something far more complicated, a bond. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question floating in the cold air between them like an unspoken promise. Luke didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. He just turned to face her, his gaze steady. She saw the scars that marked his soul, the silent battles he had fought, and the quiet strength that had led him to her. "I don't know what tomorrow holds, Emily, but I know that if we don't do this now, if we don't take that first step..." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, he wasn't the man who had saved her. He was just another broken soul hoping that somehow, somewhere, they would both find peace. She swallowed her throat tight with unspoken emotions. "I was so afraid of losing them, of losing myself," she confessed, her voice trembling. You never lost yourself, Emily. You just didn't know you had the power to take back what was always yours." Her eyes stung with tears that had been building for days, years even. She had been a prisoner to fear for so long, believing that surrender was the only way. But Luke had shown her that there was another path, a path of recklessness where you didn't wait for the world to change. You took it. You took it, and you didn't ask for permission. The sound of hooves in the distance snapped her back to reality. The men they had been waiting for, the ones who had made their lives a living hell, were on their way. She glanced back at Luke, the fear in her chest a distant echo now. "Let's finish this." He nodded once, grim and resolute. "We do this together, no turning back." The confrontation came quickly, as she knew it would. It was never going to be easy, never going to be clean. The men who had held her family hostage, who had used her body as a currency for their sins, rode in like they owned the land itself. And for a moment, Emily felt the weight of the past threatening to swallow her whole. But then, Luke moved, his hand steady on the reins, his gaze sharp. He was the calm in the storm, the protector she had always longed for, but never thought she deserved. And with him, she felt the spark of defiance. "We're here for the same thing." The leader of the group, Trenton, sneered. His voice was as cold as his eyes filled with greed and entitlement. He dismounted and stood tall, relishing the power he thought he still held over her. "Let them go." Luke's voice was a low growl, the threat in his tone unmistakable. Trenton laughed, the sound grating against Emily's nerves. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine?" His hand rested casually on the gun at his hip, a gesture of confidence that was all too familiar to her. "You've made a mistake, Cowboy. You think this ends with you saving the girl. I own her. I own all of you." For the first time in months, Emily felt something surge inside her. It wasn't fear, it wasn't shame, it was anger, deep, powerful, unrelenting. She had been someone's pawn for too long. She had been nothing but a means to an end. But not anymore. Not anymore. She whispered to herself the words, a prayer, a vow. She stepped forward, her chin raised, her fists clenched at her sides. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "And I never was." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Trenton's smug expression faltered just for a moment before he sneered again. "You think you can stand up to me? You think you can fight back?" "I don't think," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I know." The standoff that followed was brief, but brutal. There were shots fired, but they didn't come from Emily. They came from Luke. His movements swift and precise, each shot a message to the men who had thought they could control her. When it was over, the men who had terrorized them lay on the ground, their weapons discarded, their power broken. Luke stood over them, his chest heaving with exertion, but there was no triumph in his eyes, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had kept his word. Emily knelt beside her family, her hands trembling as she untied their bonds. "You're free," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You're free." Her mother's tearful gaze met hers, the unspoken words passing between them. She had never seen her mother look at her like that, not with fear, not with shame, but with love. "I'm so sorry, Emily," her mother whispered. "I never wanted this for you." Emily took her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "It's over now. It's finally over." As the sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon, Emily stood by Luke, the weight of the world finally lifted from her shoulders. She had faced the darkness, and she had walked through it. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that saloon so many months ago. She was stronger now, and for the first time in her life, she felt free. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke turned to her, his face softened by the fading light. "I didn't do this for you," he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. "You did it for yourself." Emily's heart swelled in her chest. The world might never be perfect. There would always be shadows lurking, always be battles to fight. But as long as they had each other, there was hope. And that was enough. The wind howled through the barren land, a haunting whistle that seemed to carry the weight of secrets long buried. The barn stood as a testament to years of hardship, the walls worn and weathered, but still standing. It was here in this forgotten place that Emily found herself again, standing on the precipice of a past she thought she'd left behind. Luke was behind her, his presence a quiet anchor to the storm that raged inside her. He'd been there every step of the way, patient, steady, and unwavering. But tonight was different. Tonight, the world outside mirrored the world within her, a storm of memories, grief, and the fragile thread of hope she had left. She could hear him breathing behind her, the sound of it grounding her. She had spent so many years fighting to survive, to keep going, to protect those she loved. But now, with the quiet strength of Luke beside her, she wondered, could she allow herself to finally stop fighting? Could she open up to the possibility of something more than just survival? "Emily." His voice was low, a rough edge of concern threading through the word. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for her shoulder, his fingers brushing her skin with the gentleness of someone who had long learned to tread carefully with her. She didn't turn around. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the night seemed to swallow the sky whole. "How do you do it?" "Luke." Her voice was barely a whisper, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime. He paused, unsure if he even understood the question. "Do what?" Her lips parted, then pressed together again as she struggled to find the right words. The storm outside had faded, but the storm within was only just beginning. "How do you keep going? After everything you've seen, everything you've lost, how do you still believe in people?" Luke remained silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that spoke louder than words ever could. He was thinking of his own ghosts, the ones that had followed him across the country, haunting him at every turn. He had never spoken much of them, but tonight, the weight of Emily's question seemed to pull something deep within him to the surface. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice thick with something more than regret. I think you just have to keep moving. Sometimes that's all you can do. And then you find someone worth fighting for." She felt the shift in the air between them, a tension thick and heavy, but not suffocating. He wasn't pushing her. He wasn't asking for anything more than what she was ready to give. And in that moment, Emily finally turned to face him. Her eyes were wet, but her gaze was steady. "Do you think we can ever forgive the ones who hurt us?" She asked, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it, something raw and fragile, like a wound just beginning to scab over. Luke studied her for a long moment, his hand still resting on her shoulder. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between the woman she was becoming and the girl who had once been trapped in a world of pain and betrayal. "You don't have to forgive them, Emily," he said softly. "Not for them. For you. You don't have to let them have any more of your soul." Her breath hitched in her chest, a sharp intake of air that seemed to carry all the years of hurt, of loss, of abandonment. She wanted to tell him everything about the nights she had spent crying into her pillow, about the times she had wondered if she could ever truly leave the past behind. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the space between them. Her hands found his chest, a silent plea for the comfort he had so freely offered. "I don't know if I can," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I've carried this for so long, I don't know how to put it down." Luke's hand cupped her face gently, tilting her head so that their eyes met. His thumb brushed away the tear that had slipped down her cheek. "You don't have to do it all at once, Emily. Just let it go little by little. You don't have to carry it forever." Her breath shuddered in her chest, and for the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to cry. It was a deep, painful release, the kind of cry that comes when the weight of the world has been carried too long, and the soul just can't bear it anymore. Luke didn't try to stop her. He simply held her, letting her lean into him, letting the storm of her emotions break, without fear of judgment. After a long while, the sobs faded, and she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her gaze met his, and in that moment, there was an understanding between them, an unspoken bond that neither of them had the words for. "I wish I could just forget it all," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You don't have to forget it," Luke replied gently. "You just have to learn how to live with it, and to know that it doesn't define you. What happened, it's a part of you, but it doesn't have to be all of you." She nodded slowly, taking in his words. It wasn't easy to accept, to admit that the scars of her past would always be a part of her. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in it. Luke stepped back slightly, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "You're not broken, Emily," he said, his voice steady and firm. "You're stronger than you know." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, but it wasn't one of cynicism. It was a laugh of recognition, of something finally clicking into place. She looked up at him, her gaze softening. "I don't feel strong," she said quietly. "That's okay," he replied, his voice a gentle caress. "You don't have to feel strong. You just have to keep going one step at a time." And in that moment, Emily understood. It wasn't about being strong all the time. It wasn't about conquering every fear, every wound. It was about allowing herself the space to heal, to feel, to live. And with Luke by her side, she didn't have to do it alone. For the first time in years, Emily felt something other than pain. She felt hope. And in that small, quiet moment, as the storm outside finally began to settle, she knew that the love she had longed for wasn't just a dream. It was real. It was standing right in front of her, and for the first time she let herself believe in it. The night air was thick with the scent of dust and burnt wood, the kind that lingered long after a storm had passed. Emily stood at the edge of the field, her eyes drawn to the distant silhouette of the house. Her heart beat heavy in her chest, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her like a stone. She could still hear the sound of Luke's voice in her ear, steady and calm, like the slow roll of thunder before the rain. "We'll get them back, Emily. I swear it. We do this right, and no one gets hurt." But deep inside, she knew. She knew the men who held her family weren't men of honor. They'd taken her father, her mother, her sister, her whole world, and twisted it into a weapon they could use against her. And as she stood in the shadow of the house, watching the faint glow of lanterns flicker behind the window, Emily's anger welled up inside her, hot and furious. "How many times can you let them win before you break?" She whispered to herself, the words a bitter reflection of the pain she'd kept locked inside. Not today. Not anymore. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Luke had already gone ahead, his boots leaving faint prints in the soft earth, his presence like a shadow following her every step. He'd told her to stay back, to wait for his signal. But Emily wasn't the kind of woman who could sit in the dark while her family cried out for help. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the door, the weight of her decision crashing over her like a wave. With every step, she imagined the faces of the men who'd stolen her family away, the way they'd sneered at her, the way they'd touched her when she was too afraid to fight. Emily clenched her fists, her knuckles white against the dark night, her lips parted, tasting the bitter air. "I won't be your puppet anymore." She had lost enough. Now it was time for them to lose. The door creaked open, the sound of it slicing through the silence like a knife. She could hear the low murmur of voices inside, the sound of her father's weak cough and the soft whimper of her sister. They were here, trapped like animals in a cage, and for the first time in months, Emily felt something stir deep inside her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hopelessness. It was rage. And it was going to set them free. The room was dimly lit by the flickering lantern shadows dancing across the walls as the men sat around a large table, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she spotted them, those cruel men who had torn apart her life. There was Trenton, the leader, the one who had made her family suffer. He sat at the head of the table, his hand resting on the back of a chair, like he owned everything around him. "Is she here yet?" Trenton asked, his voice smooth like oil. One of the other men, a hulking figure with a cold smirk, stood up, his eyes scanning the room. "She'll come. They always do." Emily didn't wait. She stepped into the room, her boots heavy against the wooden floor, her heart a steady drumbeat in her chest. Emily Trenton's voice was syrupy, too sweet. "I knew you'd come." She stood tall, her hands at her sides, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "You've taken everything from me," she said, her voice low, but with a bite to it. "Now I'm taking it all back." There was a flash of something in Trenton's eyes, amusement perhaps, but his smile didn't reach his eyes, and it didn't fool her. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything back? You're nothing but a tool, a toy, a distraction." His words were like poison, but they didn't have the sting they once did. Emily's eyes narrowed, and for the first time she saw him for what he truly was, a coward hiding behind money and power. "I'm not a toy," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I'm done being your pawn." Trenton's smirk faltered for just a moment, and Emily knew then that he was losing control. That was all it took. Luke stepped into the room behind her, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the floor. The men turned eyes wide as he pulled the gun from his holster and leveled it at Trenton. The air between them crackled with tension. "You'll let her family go." Luke's voice was cold, cutting through the room like a blade. "Or I'll make sure you never hurt anyone again." The men shifted, the power dynamic flipping in an instant. Trenton's face twisted in rage, his hand hovering over the knife at his side. "Do you think you can scare me, boy?" Trenton sneered, his lips curling into a snarl. "I'll make sure you regret this." But Luke didn't flinch. "No one's afraid of you anymore," he said, his voice steady. "You're nothing but a coward hiding behind wealth." The words struck Trenton like a slap. He lunged forward, but before he could make a move, Luke's gun was aimed straight at his chest. The room went silent. For a moment, it was just the three of them, Emily, Luke, and Trenton, locked in a standoff. "Let them go." Emily repeated, her voice hard as stone. "This is your last chance." Trenton looked at her, his eyes full of fury, but deep down there was a flicker of fear. Slowly he nodded, signaling to the other men. "Release them." As the men untied her family, Emily's heart soared. Her mother, frail and weak, collapsed into her arms, her tears mingling with Emily's. Her father clung to her with trembling hands, his voice breaking as he whispered her name. "Emily, we thought we'd lost you," he said, his voice ragged with emotion. "We thought we'd never see you again." She held him tight, pressing her cheek against his. "You're safe now," she whispered, feeling the weight of the years of pain and fear begin to lift from her shoulders. And then there was Luke, standing beside them, a quiet strength in his eyes. The bond between them was unspoken, but it was there, stronger than anything the world could throw at them. Trenton, defeated and broken, was left standing in the middle of the room, his power slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time, Emily felt truly free. They had won. They had taken back what was theirs. And in that moment, Emily knew no matter what came next, she had the strength to face it. Together, they would rebuild their lives. Together, they would heal. And for the first time in a long while, Emily smiled. The sun had already sunk behind the mountains, casting the sky in a muted purple glow. Emily stood at the window, watching the landscape stretch out before her like an open book, one she was still trying to read. The quiet that had settled over the house was a welcome relief after the storm. It wasn't the storm of the weather, but the kind of storm that had swept through her heart, shaking loose years of pain, regret, and loss. The quiet now was both unfamiliar and necessary, the calm after the rage of battles fought and won. She thought back to the last few days, the days when she had been trapped in the grip of a life that had no mercy. But that was all behind her now, wasn't it? Turning away from the window, Emily walked through the house that was finally becoming home. The floors, once cracked and cold, now felt warm underfoot. There was a sense of stillness here, but not the kind of stillness that came from silence, but from something deeper, healing. Luke was sitting in the corner by the fire, his face soft in the flickering glow, his eyes thoughtful. He hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived. There were things between them, unspoken things, things they both felt but couldn't yet voice. He had saved her, yes. But more than that, he had made her believe she could save herself. It was strange how love could work that way. Like a quiet wind, it would blow gently at first, barely noticed, and then it would turn into a storm that shook your world in ways you couldn't predict. But now, it was different. She could see the man beside her, not as her savior, but as the one who had helped her find her way, and that way, it seemed, was leading somewhere better. He looked up at her, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had lived through too many battles of his own. He didn't speak, but the weight of his eyes held her still. There was something unspoken between them, something she wasn't sure how to name, something that wasn't just about survival. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. "Thinking about something." Luke's eyes softened, and for a moment the harsh lines of his face seemed to fade, like he had allowed himself to rest for the first time in years. "I've been thinking about the same thing over and over," he said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion Emily couldn't place. "I've been thinking about how hard it's been for you, all you've had to endure." She nodded, but didn't say anything. The words felt too heavy, even for the space they shared now. The weight of what had happened to her was a shadow that still lingered, but it was lighter now, somehow. "And I've been thinking about how to make it right." Luke continued, his gaze not leaving hers. "How to make sure you never have to go through that again." Emily could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, a warmth spread through her chest. She didn't speak, but her hand, almost without thought, reached out to him. Their fingers brushed, and the touch felt like a promise, one that could change everything. "I don't know if I'm ready," Emily murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ready for what?" Luke asked, his voice low, soothing. "Ready for everything to be different." She hesitated, unsure if the words would even make sense. "For the past to stop following me." Luke nodded slowly, his expression understanding. "The past doesn't disappear, Emily. But it doesn't have to keep you from moving forward either." For a long moment, they sat in silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of the wind outside. Emily's mind drifted back to the life she'd left behind, the men in the saloon, their sneers, their hands on her skin, their words like daggers aimed at her soul. But then her mind turned to Luke, to the quiet strength he offered without asking for anything in return. And suddenly, the weight of the past didn't feel so suffocating anymore. "Maybe we can start over," she said, her voice tentative but firm. "Maybe it's time." Luke's eyes softened as he leaned forward, taking her hand in his touch warm and steady. "It's never too late for a new beginning, Emily. Never." They sat there together in that small moment, their hands entwined. The world outside may have been vast, but in this space, in this quiet room, they had found something worth holding on to. The silence between them wasn't awkward or strained. It was the kind of silence that felt like a soft sigh after a long day. In the distance, the sound of a horse's hooves broke the stillness, a reminder that the world outside was still turning, that there were still battles to be fought, but they weren't the only things that mattered anymore. "I think," Emily began, her voice small but resolute, "I think I'm ready to forgive myself." Luke didn't answer immediately, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, as if he knew what it meant to carry the weight of a past that wouldn't let go. And perhaps, in that moment, they both understood something deeper, that healing wasn't just about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the scars and finding peace with them. "I think that's the most important thing you could do," Luke said softly, his thumb gently tracing the back of her hand. The fire crackled again, and Emily leaned back against the arm of the chair, her eyes closing for a moment. It felt like the weight of years of grief, of regret, was starting to loosen its hold on her. For the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something new, something like hope. She hadn't been able to protect her family before, but she had protected them now. She hadn't been able to save herself from the past, but she was learning to build a future piece by piece with the help of the man beside her. And that, Emily realized, was enough. The quiet of the house wrapped around them like a soft blanket, a promise of what was to come. They had come through the storm, and though the past would always be a part of them, they were finally ready to step into the light. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Luke squeezed her hand, the warmth of his touch the only answer she needed. And in the quiet of the night, they sat together, letting the moment be enough. The sun was beginning to dip beneath the ridge, casting long shadows over the land where Emily and Luke had found their peace. The old barn behind their modest home had seen better days, but like them, it was slowly being rebuilt piece by piece. Every nail they drove into its wooden frame felt like a small victory, a quiet reclaiming of a life that had once seemed impossible. Emily stood at the doorway of the barn, the door creaking as it swung open, watching Luke work with steady hands. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his brow furrowed in concentration, but there was a peace about him now that hadn't been there before. The scars from the past, those sharp, jagged memories, were fading, softened by the steady rhythm of hard work and the warmth of shared silences. She took a deep breath, smelling the rich earth and the sweet scent of hay. The barn was a symbol not just of labor, but of the strength it took to rebuild what had been broken. "You know," Emily's voice broke the quiet as she leaned against the doorframe, her hands resting on her belly, now round with their child. "I never thought it would feel like this. I never thought I'd be here in this moment with this life." Luke stopped his work, turning to face her. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment the weight of everything between them seemed to hang in the air. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his movements slow, deliberate. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, but grounded in something deep, something that only time could forge. "I know," he said, his words carrying the weight of his own quiet revelations. "I remember when we first met. I didn't think I'd ever be the one standing here beside you either. But I guess sometimes the things we don't think we deserve are the very things that can save us." Emily smiled, the expression softening the lines of her face that had been carved by fear and loss. The world had beaten her down in ways she never thought possible. The world had made her believe she wasn't worthy of love, of peace, of safety. But here she was, in the light of day, with the man who had quietly pulled her out of the darkness. But the darkness wasn't gone. It still lived in the edges of her mind, in the stillness of the night, when the wind howled through the cracks of their home. She had learned to face it, though, to live beside it, without letting it control her. It was a dance, a quiet battle, one she fought every day. And Luke, with his steady hands and even steadier heart, had become her anchor. She walked toward him, her feet leaving soft prints in the dust of the barn floor. When she reached him, she placed a hand on his arm, feeling the strength beneath his rough skin. "Do you ever think about them? The ones who hurt us?" She asked, her voice barely a whisper, the words soft as the first light of dawn. Luke exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting toward the horizon. His jaw tightened just for a moment. The men who had stolen her family's peace, the men who had made her believe that her worth was in what she could give, not in who she was, they haunted him too. But he wasn't ready to talk about them just yet. "I think about them," he said quietly, his voice colder now, the warmth of the day leaving him for a moment. "But not like I used to. I think about them like a bad dream, something I've woken up from. I'll never forget Emily, but I don't carry them anymore." Emily nodded, understanding the weight in his words. She had been carrying that same burden for too long, and while it didn't disappear with a single decision or a single act of will, she felt it, the quiet freedom of letting it go. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but full of things left unsaid. The past was a shadow they both had to live with, but it didn't have to define them. They had built something new from the ruins. They were rebuilding not just a barn, but their lives. And each nail, each board, each small act of love was a promise to themselves that they could rise from the ashes of their past. "It's funny," Emily said, breaking the silence, her voice steady now. "How something so broken can be fixed, isn't it? I didn't think it was possible. Not with me. Not with any of it." Luke smiled, his eyes softening as he reached out to pull her into his arms. The warmth of his embrace filled her, wrapped around her like a blanket. There was no more fear in him, no more doubt that she was his home. "It's never too late to rebuild," he murmured, his lips brushing her hair. "And you're more than enough. You've always been." In that moment, Emily understood something she hadn't fully realized before. Love was never about perfection. It wasn't about waiting for the right time, the right moment, or the right person. It was about choosing day after day to show up, to love, to rebuild even when the world around you seemed to be falling apart. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting its golden light over their small homestead, Emily and Luke stood together, not just as survivors, but as builders. Builders of a new life, a new future, and most of all, a new family. And though the past would always be a part of them, like the land they stood on, like the barn they were restoring, they had found a way to rise above it, together. And maybe that was all anyone could ever hope for. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue across the valley, its light bathing the land in a soft warmth, as if nature itself were wrapping the world in a quiet embrace. Emily stood at the edge of the porch, her hand lightly resting on the worn wood of the railing, looking out at the vast expanse that now felt like home. She'd often wondered if the land could truly heal a person. But today, she felt the truth in her bones. A year had passed since they'd left the town that once held her in a vice grip of fear. A year since Luke had pulled her from the ashes of her past and led her into the light of something better. Yet, as much as her heart had healed, there were days when the past would still whisper to her in the quiet moments. She could still hear the mocking laughter of the men in the saloon, still feel the weight of their cruel hands, still smell the stale whiskey that had poisoned her youth. But now there was peace. The fields stretched out before her, the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass, carrying a soft melody. It was a far cry from the nights of terror in that God-forsaken town. She could almost taste the freedom in the air. Luke appeared beside her, his boots making soft thuds against the wooden steps. He said nothing at first, just stood beside her. His eyes trained on the horizon as well. They didn't need words anymore. They understood each other in the stillness, a silent language forged through shared battles and brokenness. "You've done good," Emily Luke said. Finally, his voice steady, but there was something deeper there, something raw, something that carried the weight of everything they had endured. He wasn't just talking about the land they had worked together or the house they had built with their own hands. He was talking about her. Emily nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the view before her. "I don't know if it was good, Luke. I just know I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them take everything from me. From us." Her voice trembled, but she held firm. The tears she'd once cried for the life she'd lost had dried long ago, but it didn't mean the scars had vanished. Luke's hand brushed against hers, warm and strong. "You did more than survive, Emily. You fought, and now you're free." She glanced at him, then her eyes searching his face, looking for the truth in his words. She had come to rely on his steadiness, the quiet strength he carried with him. But even now, after everything, a part of her still feared the storms that might come. They stood there side by side for a long while. Then Emily spoke again, her voice low, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I always thought, if I could just get out, if I could just run far enough, I'd be okay. But it's more than that, isn't it? You can't outrun the things that haunt you. They follow you until you face them." Luke didn't respond immediately, but his eyes softened. He understood. She was still facing the ghosts of her past, facing the betrayal of the men who had held her captive, facing the helplessness she had once felt, facing the pieces of her life she had left behind. And then there was the one man who had hurt her the most. Her father. He was the one who had sold her to them, who had traded her dignity for his own survival. He had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way, and yet she still carried his blood in her veins. She wasn't sure if she would ever be able to forgive him for that. But Luke had taught her something she had never known before. That forgiveness wasn't always for the other person. Sometimes it was for you, for the peace you needed to carry on. And maybe, just maybe, that peace was the true reward for the good. The sound of hooves broke the silence, and Emily turned to see a figure approaching on horseback. It was Ben, one of the ranch hands they had hired to help with the land. He was waving something in his hand, a letter, and as he rode closer, Emily's heart skipped a beat. A letter. Who could it be from "Morning, Miss Emily"? Ben said, tipping his hat. "This came for you." Emily reached for the letter, her fingers brushing against the envelope worn from the journey. She tore it open with trembling hands, her heart suddenly heavy with anticipation. It was from the town, the same town that had once held her in its grip, the town that had made her believe she was nothing more than an object to be used and discarded. She read the letter quickly, her eyes scanning the words as if they could erase the past with their meaning. It was an apology. The town, it seemed, had begun to reckon with its demons. The men who had enslaved her with their wealth, who had controlled her every move, had been forced to confront the damage they had caused. The letter was from the town council, a formal statement of regret, acknowledging the pain they had inflicted on her and her family. They had come to understand the horrors they had allowed to flourish under their noses. Emily's hand shook as she lowered the letter. She had expected anger. She had expected bitterness. but all she felt was a strange kind of relief, like a weight she hadn't realized was pressing on her chest had been lifted. Luke, standing beside her, read her expression. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice careful. "It says they're sorry," Emily whispered, as though the words themselves were too foreign to be true. "They want to make things right. They say they've come to understand the harm they did, and they want to offer reparations." Luke was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he spoke. "What do you think, Emily? Does it change anything?" She thought about it for a long time. The town had once been her prison, and now it seemed they were offering her a way out, an acknowledgement of the wrongs done to her. But could a letter truly make up for what had been lost? Could words heal the scars they had left behind? "I think," she said, her voice soft yet resolute, "I think the only thing that matters now is how we choose to live, Luke. We don't need their apology. We don't need their money. We have each other, and we have this land." She looked around at the fields, the house they had built with their own hands. "This is our reward, the good we've done, the life we've created. That's what matters." Luke nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. "You're right. This is the only reward we need." Emily folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her pocket. There would be no more bitterness, no more hatred, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built from love and hard work. And as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the land, Emily knew she had found something more precious than anything money could buy. She had found peace. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land as the wind whispered through the dry grass. Emily stood on the porch, her fingers trailing lightly over the rough wood of the railing, feeling the steady pulse of the earth beneath her feet. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something waiting for her. Her mind wandered back, as it often did in quiet moments like these. The memories of the past clung to her like the dust on her boots, haunting her in ways she couldn't escape. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warm breeze fill her lungs, grounding her in the present. It had taken a lifetime of pain to get here, a lifetime of sacrifice, loss, and heartache. And yet, here she was, standing in the aftermath of it all, on the cusp of something new. "Luke," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the sound of the wind. She had never thought she would feel this way, strong, sure, and yet so tender in the moments that mattered most. But Luke had taught her something she never thought she would learn. He had taught her that love didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it was simply standing beside someone, knowing that they had your back, even in silence. Luke stepped out from the shadows of the barn, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He had always carried himself with such quiet strength, a man of few words but endless actions. His eyes met hers, those deep, knowing eyes that had seen her at her lowest, and still he had chosen her. A half smile tugged at his lips, but it was the softness in his gaze that spoke the loudest. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, gentle, as though he knew exactly what she was feeling without needing to ask. Emily nodded slowly, the weight of the years lifting from her chest, even if just for a moment. She took a breath, and with it, she let go of the fear that had held her captive for so long. "I think I am," she said, her voice steady, but the words felt like the first breath she had taken in a long time. Luke stepped closer, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos of her emotions. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Sometimes just being there was enough. In the distance, the sound of hooves echoed, breaking the stillness. A rider approached, his silhouette growing larger as he drew closer to the house. Emily's heart gave a small lurch. She knew who it was before he even reached the gate. The rider dismounted with a practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He removed his hat, his face as cold and unyielding as the stone he had always been. Thaddeus Vane, Emily's father. The man who had sold her for a handful of silver, the man who had never once looked at her as a daughter. He approached slowly, his eyes scanning the land as if it were his to claim, and Emily's heart tightened in her chest. She had never forgiven him for the choices he had made, for the years of torment, for the part he had played in her suffering. Yet as he drew nearer, something unexpected shifted within her. It was not anger that rose in her, but something quieter, something heavier. It was the weight of a past that could never be undone, but could at least be acknowledged. "Emily," he said, his voice low and stiff, like a man who had spent too long burying his emotions. "I've come to say I'm sorry for what I did to you, to our family." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to show up at all, much less apologize. "You're sorry." Her voice shook with disbelief, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Sorry for what, Father? For selling me to the highest bidder, for throwing me away like I meant nothing." Her voice cracked, the years of pain spilling out in one sharp exhale. Thaddeus flinched, the pain in her words hitting him harder than any physical blow ever could. His eyes flickered to the ground, unable to meet hers. "I was wrong," he muttered, the words thick with shame. "I was a coward. I did what I thought was best, but I was wrong. I see that now." Emily stood frozen, her gaze fixed on him, the weight of his apology hanging between them like an anchor. She wanted to feel something, anything other than this numbness, this hollow emptiness that had followed her all her life. But there was nothing, no satisfaction, no sense of closure, just the aching realization that the father she had once loved could never be the man she needed him to be. Luke stepped forward, then his hand brushing against Emily's arm in silent support. He looked at Thaddeus, his face unreadable, and for a moment the two men stood there in the quiet, the tension between them thick enough to slice with a knife. "You can't undo the past," Luke said, his voice steady, but with a hardness that wasn't there before. "But you can choose to leave it behind. If you've come here to make amends, start by walking away, and don't come back." Emily didn't need to look at Luke to know what he was feeling. His words were a protective shield, not just for her, but for himself. He was protecting the future. They had built a future that had no place for people like Thaddeus. People who only knew how to take, and never how to give. Thaddeus stood there for a long moment, as if weighing his options, but in the end, he nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own guilt. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps soft against the earth. Emily watched him go, her heart still heavy with the years of hurt, but for the first time she didn't feel like she was being dragged down with him. She felt something else, a quiet peace that had settled over her like the evening air. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in a soft golden light. Emily turned to Luke, her hand finding his, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the present. They didn't need to say anything. There were no words left to speak. They had made it through the storm, together. As the night settled around them, Emily knew one thing for sure: there was no going back, but the future was wide open. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to step into it.